I had a good friend contact me asking if I could look at their trimmer, and of course I said sure. Now, I wasn't given much information about it, but from what they mentioned, I think it has some sort of starting or running problem, but it really doesn't matter because I enjoy finding out for myself what the problem really is. Unfortunately, those are famous last words because this one is going to give me a hard time all the way to the very end. In today's video, we look at this trimmer, and the problem is that according to the owner, it doesn't always start, and if it does happen to start, it doesn't stay running for long. Now, from the little information I've gotten, it would seem that we have a carb issue. The reason I say that is that we know it has the ability to start, but it's not consistent, and if it does start and the carb is having an issue delivering fuel, then it's not going to stay running. Now, I'm going to try and repair this trimmer, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. If things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. The first thing that I want to do is to look around and see if there's anything broken or missing. I know that I say that a lot, but trust me, one day something is going to be missing and it's going to affect how we fix it. But of course, as usual on this one, I don't see anything that would keep it from starting. Now, the most likely reason this trimmer is having starting issues would be the fuel in the tank, but since it didn't come with any in it, it means we won't be able to rule it out. Now, I don't have a problem with this brand at all. I think they make a quality product, but here's the problem. I'm not buying them to fix them. Other people are buying them, having issues, and then I step in when they need help. The fact that I don't get a lot of these to work on means either they never have problems, which I don't believe to be true, or what's most likely the issue is that a lot of people overlook them as well, either buying above or below its price range. So I don't feel it's just me when I say I overlook this brand a lot. Now, I do have a criticism about this particular trimmer, and I don't think I'm being too critical. So the problem I have has to do with the recoil system. I don't care for the spring-assisted recoil. Now, maybe this design isn't intended for me and maybe for a different demographic, but as of right now, I don't like having to pull the handle all the way out for it to turn the engine over. The reason is very simple. It forces me to make a full pull versus a quality pull. Maybe I'm being a bit picky, but at least I'm being honest about it. The next thing I want to do is confirm that the engine will start and run for a second after putting fuel into the carb's throat. I know I was told that it has the ability to start and run, but I can't take their word for it. I need to confirm it for myself. Luckily, it started and ran, which is great news because it means I can finally dive into the carb and see what's wrong with it. So at this point, if I was working at a shop, I would go to the parts department with my paperwork and request for a carb kit or a new carb. But since I'm not at the shop, I'm going to take a few minutes to take the carb off and inspect it. It's at this point where I have to decide if I need to replace the carb, clean it, or try to service it. So how do I decide on what to do? Well, that's pretty easy. If I open the carb and there's a lot of deposits in it, I'd probably just replace it versus taking a lot of time cleaning it. However, if I open it and there's nothing wrong with it other than a couple of bad diaphragms, I'd get a kit and rebuild it. But if the only problem is the metering diaphragm, I'd probably clean it, check for flow, replace the diaphragm, and then put it back together, hoping I didn't just waste my time. So what happens when I get it back together and I start having issues with the carb? Simple, I try to adjust the carb, and if that doesn't work, then I have to make a different decision about what to do. Now, I get a lot of comments where viewers will ask me questions about what to do after they've done all they could. Most of the time, I tell them that they need to replace the carb if they haven't already done that. But what if they've already replaced the carb, in fact, the entire fuel system? Easy. I'll ask them to make adjustments to the carb so it's going to work with an old engine. The problem is that adjusting a carb is like tuning a car. You have to have some experience, otherwise you're going to break something. And if they've done the adjustments and it still won't work like it's supposed to, then that's when you throw in the towel and hand it to someone who has more experience in the tools for more diagnostic work. The problem is that by that time, the cost in time and parts will be more than the machine is worth. That brings us to our next point. Not every piece of equipment is worth fixing. In fact, when I was doing this kind of hobby years ago, there wasn't as many aftermarket suppliers as now, so to fix a machine, you would have to buy OEM parts, which meant it simply wasn't worth it. If it wasn't for the aftermarket right now, I doubt I'd be trying to fix anything, simply because it would make more sense to buy new even at today's inflated prices. After switching to a different fuel filter, make sure there's enough fuel line in the tank. That way it allows the filter to stay submerged in the fuel while the trimmer head is near the ground. I do apologize for the mix-match fuel lines. This trimmer happened to catch me at a time when I was low on fuel line. The reason for that is because I like to buy a variety pack when it comes to fuel lines, which comes in different sizes, but I only get about 3 meters of line for each type, which for me doesn't last very long. In the future, I'm going to consider getting about 20 to 30 feet at a time, if not more. The first thing I want to do is look at the inlet screen, and what I'm looking for is debris that might be clogging it, but as you can see, this one is clean, which is great news. The next thing I want to check is the pumping diaphragm. What I'm looking for are the check valve flaps. I need to make sure they're parallel with the rest of it, and the easiest way to do that is to look at it from the side. Now, if they're bent up or down, then the pump is not going to work very well, and I would consider a rebuild kit or replacing the carb. Now, this one is good, so I'm going to reuse it. Now, the pumping membrane is also important, as you want to make sure it'll spring back into position if you push on it. Now, this particular material really never has any issues. It's typically the older style that's made out of rubber that seems to have problems over time. The next part I want to check is, of course, the metering diaphragm. Its job is to control fuel flow through the carb. It's supposed to be soft and pliable, but if it starts to become petrified, it's not going to work like it's supposed to. As expected, this one has seen better days and has begun to harden, which means we'll need to replace it. Otherwise, fuel is not going to make it out of the carb and the engine is not going to start. Now, don't throw this part away, and the reason is because we need to reuse the gasket that's stuck to it. Now, after separating them and flicking the diaphragm, you can hear just how stiff it's become. It's not supposed to sound like this. So here's a new one, and as you cannot hear, it's not making any sounds when I do the same to it. Now, the next step is very important, and if you don't do it, you could be wasting your time. What I'm going to do is confirm that fuel will flow through the screen. The way I'm going to do that is to put fuel into the pocket for the screen and then press the rocker arm on the other side. The fuel should then disappear through the screen. However, if it doesn't, it means we'll have to take it apart and clean it using carb cleaner. Now, ours is disappearing, which is great, and that means we can start to put the carb back together with the new metering diaphragm, and hopefully we can get this trimmer working like it's supposed to. Unfortunately, sometimes things don't go according to plan. Now, before we get done with the reassembly and the final installation, I'm going to let you know there's going to be some serious issues along with clues. That way you can tell something is not right. I typically mention these issues in my videos, and well, they're all going to show up in this video in a very nasty way. Now, I typically never dive too far into each clue to each issue, but on this one, we're going to take a deep dive because, let's be honest, I'm kind of overdue for some serious issues with the repair. Now, when connecting the fuel lines, the filter line will connect to the port furthest away from the bulb, while the return line connects to the port near the bulb. Now, if you mix them up, the carb's inlet screen will clog with debris that's floating in the fuel. The next thing I'm going to do is to put fresh fuel into the tank so we can test if it's flowing through the lines like it's supposed to, because if it's not, the engine is less likely to start and run like it's supposed to. If you didn't realize it, that was a lot of foreshadowing. So when pressing the bulb, fuel should come up from the tank through the filter line into the carb and then fill the bulb. It should then leave the carb through the return line and go back to the tank. After what seemed like 3 minutes of pressing, the bulb was finally filling with some fuel. Now, it is flowing like it should, but the problem is the amount coming into the bulb. It's not very much. In fact, if I had to describe it, I'd say it was anemic at best. The problem is that with this meager amount in the bulb, it points to a restricted fuel flow through the carb, which is not ideal. Now, if that's the case, we'll need to make adjustments to the fuel screws to make up for it, but to make these adjustments, we'll need a special tool. For this carb, you'll need the splined tool, but yours might be a little different. If you need a set of these, there's a link in the description. Now, the screw closer to the engine is the L screw, and it's for adjusting fuel delivery for idling and while squeezing the trigger. The screw closer to the air filter is the H screw, and it's for adjusting fuel delivery when the trigger is completely squeezed. And as someone so nicely put it, yes, either screw has the ability to affect the other setting. That's typically meant for more advanced tuning, but for right now, we'll keep it basic and say one is for idling while the other one is for wide open throttle. Now before we make any adjustments, I want to turn the screws clockwise until they stop to find out where each one is set at. After that, I'll then turn them back to where I found them. This helps me to figure out how it's adjusted and afterwards how far I had to adjust them to get it to run the right way. It also allows me to put them back to where I found them. So it turns out the H screw was 2.5 turns out while the L screw was about 2 turns out. I'll then turn them back to where I found them. Just for your information, these settings only apply to this particular engine. Yours may not necessarily be the same for it to run the same way. Now, I'm pretty sure there are factory settings, but at this point, these may not be them because who knows what's been done to this trimmer in all these years. The last thing to do is to put the air filter base back on, and then we'll try and start it and see if we can get it working again. So luckily the engine started and ran, but unfortunately it didn't stay running. By the way it stopped, it seemed to be running out of fuel, but before I make any adjustments, I want to give it another try and see if it does it again. So this time it didn't run like the first time. In fact, it stopped even sooner while partially choked. Now I do think it's a fuel flow issue, so I'm going to pull more fuel into the lines and carb, try to start it again, and then decide what kind of adjustments to make. Now, by the way, it's running and stopping while it's idling. I think I'm going to try to give it more fuel, and to do that, I'm going to turn the L screw counterclockwise, starting with a quarter turn. So it's still not running for any longer, which is quite strange. Typically after one adjustment, it usually performs quite a bit better. I'll give it another quarter turn and see what happens. Now at this point, I'm going to keep making adjustments to the L screw, which does not work out. Out of desperation, I even started making adjustments to the H screw, which also doesn't make any difference either. So now comes the problem. I can either take the carb apart again and clean it, or just buy a new carb and don't waste my time on the old carb. That brings me to the question I have for you. What should I do next on this project? Clean it or replace it? Unfortunately, this is where we have to leave the project until the next part. Another reason why this trimmer won't stay running is because the filter or fuel line I chose to use has a restriction or blockage in it. Not sure which one it is, but either one could cause the purge bulb from filling with fuel, which of course means we'll have a fuel delivery issue as well. The fix is to replace the fuel lines and filter, and hopefully the bulb will get more fuel, indicating better flow. So in the end, this trimmer finally showed an issue that I think I've never had to explain on either of my channels, which is poor fuel flow through the lines. Hopefully the next part of the video will fix it, and then we'll be able to figure out what really happened to it. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.